Hi everyone, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you so much for joining us, and I thank you to Jakarta and for the Sikh and Punjabi Studies department for holding this conversation and for allowing all of us to come together and have these sorts of critical conversations that are often, like Jatinder was saying, that are left unspoken. So. My name is Nanki. I'm a graduate student of social work and public health at UCLA, and I'm in my second year. And this is a project that I did a couple of years ago. This isn't related to my work that I do now, but I still think it's very relevant, and I wanted to share it with everyone here. Okay. All right. So my focus, my research focus is on kind of the subjective well-being or internal sense of self among marginalized populations. And in this project, I'm focusing specifically on young Kaurs. And I do this because, in the literature, there is a lot of conversations about Sikh immigrant experiences. But what is lacking that I found is when the children of these immigrants are coming of age, their perspectives and their realities in negotiating a dual identity are often left, untouched or unexplored. So that's kind of where my personal motivations are coming into this research. And I also, just going back to the conversation about holding these critical dialogues, I encourage everyone to kind of just have an open mind. Even me, as I'm standing here, I consider myself a really confident public speaker, but my voice is shaking right now because I've never done a talk like this that I consider coming from a liberatory approach in front of an intergenerational audience. And I think that's really tough for me because, there is that sense of silence among youth in our community, that disconnect that we feel intergenerationally. So if these conversations feel uncomfortable for you, think about that these are actually the lived realities of people. These are actually the daily lives, of the people of the Kaurs that I worked with. So if it feels uncomfortable, that's good. All right. So for my research questions, I was asking two questions. One was, how do adolescent Kaurs, while coming of age as the children of American immigrants, negotiate their sense of self in Sikh and Western contexts? And what issues arise, and how do they negotiate their experiences with power? So very abstract and very kind of hard to measure, but this was a qualitative study. And in the literature, there's been kind of a narrative around South Asian immigrants coming off as backwards to the Western context. There's been talks about kind of a rise in girl power and feminist ideologies, and that's kind of what I want to highlight in this research. How are Sikh Kaurs actually changing or impacting Sikh, this overall Sikh community? They're not just a neglected voice, but they're actually they're actually having an impact. So this qualitative study, I worked with 6 Kaurs, ages 10 to 17, and it was a total of 6 meetings at our local San Jose Gurdwara. And I did snowball sampling, and it was a mix of open-ended and semi-structured interviews, of focus groups, and something called testimonio, which I will briefly go over. It's essentially a liberatory methodology rooted in Latin American history And it is essentially it is under the assumption that folks who are marginalized under a collective kind of reality that is happening. So if one individual is telling a story, we can tie that story into kind of a broader reality. That story is not happening in isolation. And I like this methodology because it transcends kind of the basic narrative or the basic interview format where you're kind of just asking robotic questions back and forth, but it's actually kind of going beyond and transcending and questioning institutional power, questioning why is this the reality? Why what are the broader institutions that are creating this life for this specific individual at this time? And actually working together to create more equitable frameworks. So through my data analysis, I utilize grounded theory, which is basically the opposite of the scientific method, where we're actually utilizing the lived experiences and narratives of folks to construct a theory bottom up instead of top down. So it's creating theories based on people's lives. So I came up with 3 categories that manifest in young Kaurs' lives, and these are all, and they're all numbered 1, sorry, but they are all kind of phenomenons that manifest in Kaurs' lives that manifest both in the Sikh and Western context. And I argue that it's a double-edged sword because these are things that are happening in both contexts, but whereas in one context it comes off as empowering, in another context it'll come off as disempowering. And I kind of conceptualize it as a gradient almost. So on this side we have the Western context where I'm arguing in a lot of situations Kaurs are disempowered, and in the Sikh context where they are empowered. And each kind of category comes off as a gradient, and I'll go over each one. So this is where it gets both uncomfortable and both commonsensical in a way. These are all kind of things that we know happen, at kind of internal dialogues that we know happen in our Kaurs' like lives, but they're not really kind of talked about. So the first category I conceptualize as private as public. So the idea that in a Sikh woman's life, her private life is kind of shown to becomes a public affair in many ways. And one way in which I saw this very poignantly happening was in hair. In our Sikh faith, it is a very visceral and aesthetic representation of our, connection to our faith. So this notion of being either religious or westernized and this push of pull between these two different ways of life was very much at play. And so these are kind of some of the quotes that they were telling me that they hear at school, where they're constantly monitored by their peers on their hair. So you have dead ends, you should cut your hair. Are you going to trim your hair when you're out of the house? And she said, I'm totally fine with it. Why do I have to cut it? And then I was actually very surprised. A lot of the girls were saying, oh yeah, most girls don't really say anything, but I know they're thinking it to themselves. So they're looking at it and they're thinking about it, but they won't say it out loud. And I was just very struck by this notion of they know they're being kind of watched in a way. They know they are the other, but they really can't do anything about it. And I was also kind of struck by that internal sense of a lot of them were countering it with like, I'm totally fine, why do I have to cut it? And that's kind of where I see the double-edged sword coming in. It's kind of a push and pull, and it can be disempowering and empowering in different ways. and another context that the private also becomes public is in marriage. The good Sikh girl. So because the notion of arranged marriage is still prevalent in South Asian and Sikh cultures, it makes the socialization of Sikh girls a lot different than other mainstream communities. So whereas girls are also monitored on their hair in the Western context at school, at home, they're monitored on their romantic life, their dating life. And, you know, the family is, you know, I'm conceptualizing the family as the public. So a girl's internal life becomes public to her family. And one story that came out when I was interviewing one of the girls was that her mom found out that she was texting a boy, and I think she was a teenager. She was like 17. And suddenly this became a whole ordeal in the family, and you know, this issue was brought to the whole family. There was a whole table discussion about it, and I think this isn't a very uncommon situation that happens in our communities. But I think we need to talk about it because it has a real impact on the mental health of young Kaurs. And she was reflecting after telling me about it, and she was saying, I don't think dating would be as tough on my brother as it was on me. Because first of all, I'm the first child of this family, and I'm a girl. As much as people say there aren't gender stereotypes anymore, especially Indian parents, they still have that boy-girl thing. Boys can be given more freedom because they're not as delicate or fragile as girls. And that also struck me because just seeing a 17-year-old girl having that sort of self-reflexivity on her social, you know, positionality as a woman was really jarring for me. And I'm saying that if a girl is obliging to the expectations set out for her, it can be empowering. But a lot of the time, you know, our lives are a lot more complex and nuanced than the expectations that are set out for us. So in that way, it becomes disempowering. Someone else was talking about that happy medium that women have to just magically touch. You have to be right in the middle or you're just off. So she kind of listed what she believes the expectations for her are as a woman in terms of marriage, and, you know, and things that she thinks sometimes people look down on women for. And then she ends with, I don't know. And I thought that was very telling because it's like that constant internal narrative of going back and forth, like what am I expected to do? What do I want to do? You know, and constantly having to grapple with that. So the next category that came out during the interviews was academic achievement. We are taught, women especially, that financial self-sufficiency within our community is very, very important, which, you know, it is. It is important for a woman to be able to stand on her own and, you know, earn an income and everything that is associated with being financially independent. But I think what is left out of this conversation, the disempowering aspect of it, is two things. One, the assimilation. We don't talk about that this narrative is playing into kind of the model minority and myth. And the model minority myth is an expectation that has been kind of given to us by our capitalist society, and it's not something that immigrants themselves have created as the ideal life for themselves. It's kind of like, this is expectations for you, go do it. If you comply, you will be rewarded with social status, money, reputation, and everything else. And if you don't, you're ostracized or whatever else happens to women who don't comply. And the other aspect I think that is left out of these conversations is kind of similar, the idea of assimilation. So a lot, like, these are expectations that are set out for able, 5 minutes, okay, for able-bodied folks and a lot of the time these are not things that women want to do or can do, and yeah, so I think those are people that get left out of this conversation. So these are just some quotes. I won't read through them, but they're just some quotes kind of articulating what I already just said. So the competition aspect that comes out of it, kind of the parents' distorted views of what their daughter's friends are doing and why their daughter is not up to par with that. Also kind of the status piece of it, and she said the UCLA before I went to UCLA, so I thought that was funny, but she's like the fact that, you know, everything comes back to pride, everything comes back to loki kenge in our community, everything comes back to bragging rights. And then I also found the last piece really jarring as well, and relatable. My mom wants me to get out of the house and, quote, see the real world, but not get too far as to where I can't come back physically. And, you know, I took that to mean, like, yeah, go out there and find yourself, become independent, but don't go too far as to where you forget your duties as a mother, as a potential wife, as a daughter-in-law, you know. So go far, but remember you always have to come back. And again, that goes back to kind of that happy medium that's always never reachable, but we know it's there. And lastly, the third category that came out during the interviews was the practice of faith. And this is also a double-edged sword because it is both empowering and oppressive at the same time. So when I asked these girls how they define beauty, all of them without exception responded to something along the lines of, inner beauty is not how you look, it is how you act. Beauty from outside, like makeup and all, means nothing. It is the inside beauty that matters. And when I asked them where they got those values, I thought that was beautiful, and I asked them where they got those values from, and they said, you know, Khalsa school, and we learned this in Sikhi, that, you know, it's not your outside or exterior that matters. And this was actually a 10-year-old girl that said this. This was, like, crazy. And yeah, so, but I also kind of saw a hesitation because while, you know, our Sikhi is giving such confidence to these girls, it is still very obvious that they're restricted in being able to fully practice their faith. And this specifically in terms of keeping their hair. I know that's not the full scope of our religion, but I'm focusing on that for this research. And so I asked them, like, say no one at school or anyone in public commented on your hair, would you still shave? And there was a long pause, and someone said, you know, they probably say it behind your back. And someone else agreed, yeah, they probably think it or are judging you silently behind your back. And then one girl said, I would be so happy. And someone said, I would shave because keeping hair is not normal, so I don't want to be like out. So in this way, I saw that practicing faith is also a paradox, yet another paradox, in terms of granting young Kaurs individual power while also simultaneously removing it in different contexts. And just to wrap up, I have 1 more minute. So what, you know, this was all, like I said, it's pretty common sense things. These are things we hear in our community. But like, what do we do with this? What do we take away with it? I think one, it points to, oh, I'm so sorry. I think one, it points to opportunities for Sikh and Western communities to take steps in providing safe spaces for growing Kaurs. I think it's obvious now that making things taboo or not appropriate to talk about it's just not working for a lot of people. And it's working for men because their issues are talked about. I mean, not all of them, but these are issues that are taboo, and that is why I said my voice is shaking today. And I think, this is a first step towards making those issues non-taboo. And second and third, I think this study also complicated studies of adolescence by incorporating the specific race, religion, and cultural negotiation that goes on for second generation Kaurs. And it also complicates Sikh studies because Sikh studies tend to neglect discussions of both teen and female experiences. Fourth, I think we need to complicate our understandings of what we've defined to be, quote, good for our girls and our women, and also critically question who defined that in the first place. Like I said, these testimonios aren't anything new or surprising. They're ingrained ideologies within our communities and broader culture that underpin every action, behavior, and every way of being and relating with one another. They're both contemporary and in old songs. We hear it in boliyan, we hear it in Punjabi music industry, we hear it everywhere, and it's in our culture. Think of all the boliyan that poke fun at in-laws, the boliyan that talk about the struggles of married life, or the culturally cherished songs of sorrow and bereavement upon a daughter leaving her home for a stranger's home and becoming a stranger to her own home. These are all ideologies that we don't critically question, and we should. And a lot of the time, these are ideologies that women are not able to talk about, so they talk about through boliyan in a way that they're able to make comedic and kind of trivialize them in a way, but also kind of vent. So I think this study was just taking a critical lens and looking at, things that we take for granted with a critical eye. And lastly, it is important to remember that growing Kaurs are resilient. I'm definitely not here promoting a deficit-based or victim mentality of growing Kaurs. We are actively shaping and transforming what we define as our culture through our lived experiences. And I think we just need to be given the platform to share her stories. So thank you.